Okay, so here's something that's going to mess with your head. A wall of water, 15 feet tall, moving faster than you can run, hit a town of 8,000 people, and most of them weren't even home. Here's the jaw-dropper. Ian wasn't supposed to hit Fort Myers, not even close. It was tracking toward Tampa Bay, one of the most vulnerable cities in the entire United States. Meteorologists were calling it a potential catastrophe for millions. And then, at the very last moment, Ian turned. It shifted south, and it aimed directly at a stretch of southwest Florida that had almost no storm surge protection whatsoever. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why it happened and why it will almost certainly happen again. Stick around, because the most insane part of this story isn't the wind, it's the water. All right, let's go back to September 23rd, 2022. It's a Friday. People in Florida are doing their Friday things. Traffic, football, whatever. And out there in the central Caribbean Sea, this little cluster of thunderstorms starts to organize itself. Nothing alarming, just a tropical disturbance. The kind of thing meteorologists watch with one eye while they're drinking their coffee. But here's where it gets interesting. The Caribbean that September was not normal. The sea surface temperatures, the water temperature near the top of the ocean, was running about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit above average. That might not sound like a lot, but in hurricane science, that's like adding nitro to a race car engine. See, a hurricane is essentially a heat engine. It pulls warm, moist air up from the ocean's surface, releases that energy as the moisture condenses into clouds and rain, and that released energy drives the winds. The warmer the water, the more energy the storm can pull up. It's that simple, and it's that terrifying. By Monday, September 26th, that little cluster of thunderstorms had a name, Tropical Storm Ian, and it was already getting bigger. Over the next 22 hours, from Monday into Tuesday, Ian gained 67% more strength. Not 10%, not 20%, 67% in less than a day. The technical term for this is rapid intensification. The National Hurricane Center defines it as gaining at least 35 miles per hour in sustained wind speed within 24 hours or less. Ian blew past that threshold like it wasn't even there. By September 26th, Ian had already become a Category 1 hurricane and was barreling toward Cuba. And here's something worth pausing on for just a second. Cuba has been hit by a lot of hurricanes. Like, a lot. The people there know what a hurricane looks like. They know the drill. And yet, when Ian made landfall in western Cuba on September 27th as a Category 3 hurricane, the entire island lost power. Every light, every hospital generator, every traffic signal, gone. The flooding was so severe that the entire national power grid just collapsed. 5 people died in Cuba, and Ian barely even flinched. Most hurricanes weaken when they cross over land. It makes sense, right? They're heat engines fueled by warm water. Take them off the water, and the fuel cuts off. Ian crossed the entire western end of Cuba. It wasn't a tiny hop across a narrow strip, and it barely weakened. And then it hit the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf that September was holding an extraordinary amount of stored heat. But it wasn't just the surface temperature. The deep water was warm too, unusually warm. Normally, as a hurricane churns across the ocean, its spinning winds mix cooler deep water up to the surface, which acts like a natural break. But in the Gulf that year, the water was warm all the way down, which meant there was almost nothing to slow Ian down. And Ian fed on every single calorie of it. Real quick, before we get into what actually happened when Ian hit land, I want to ask you something. Where were you when Hurricane Ian hit? If you were in Florida, if you rode it out, evacuated, watched it from somewhere else entirely, drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Because the human side of this story is just as wild as the science, And I want to hear it from people who were actually there. Okay, back to the monster. September 28th, 2022, early morning. Ian is now a Category 5 hurricane, the most powerful category on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Peak winds of 160 miles per hour. A NOAA weather drone flying directly into the storm recorded wind gusts of 216 miles per hour. Let me say that again, 216 miles per hour. That's faster than the fastest production car on Earth. But here's where the story takes its turn, and it's the turn that made Ian infamous in meteorological history. For days, the forecast models had been pointing toward Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is one of the most hurricane-vulnerable cities in the entire United States. It's a shallow, funnel-shaped body of water that essentially acts like a storm surge amplifier. The last major hurricane to directly hit Tampa was in 1921. Over a century of no major direct hits, meaning a population that had largely never experienced a storm surge event. Millions of people. And the models were saying, this is the one. Evacuations were called, hotels filled up, highways clogged. People who'd never evacuated before packed up their cars. And then Ian shifted. Not a lot, not a dramatic overnight change, just gradually, the storm's track bent southward, toward Charlotte Harbor, toward Cayo, Costa, toward Fort Myers Beach. And while Tampa got relatively spared, Southwest Florida, which had been in a lower risk zone in many earlier models, got the full fury of a nearly Category 5 hurricane. At 3:05 p.m. Eastern Time on September 28, 2022, Hurricane Ian made landfall on Cayo, Costa, a small barrier island near Cape Coral, as a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and a central pressure of 941 millibars. Now, if you want to understand why Ian was so deadly, you have to understand storm surge. Because honestly, the wind, as violent as it was, wasn't the killer. It was the water. Storm surge is what happens when a hurricane's low pressure system and its spiraling winds literally push the ocean inland. The storm acts like a giant, slow-moving plow. It scoops up the surface of the sea and shoves it onto the coast in a massive, fast-moving wall of salt water. It's not a wave, exactly. It's more like, imagine someone just tilting the ocean toward the shore. The water doesn't break and recede like a wave. It rises, and it keeps rising, and it fills everything. Streets, houses, cars, first floors, second floors, like a bathtub filling up, except you're inside it. Ian's storm surge reached 15 feet above normal high water levels in the hardest hit areas. Fort Myers Beach, population around 8,000, was essentially erased. The town vice mayor, Jim Adderholt, later compared the destruction to what European cities looked like after World War II bombing campaigns. That is not hyperbole. Aerial photographs taken the next day showed a barrier island that looked like it had been scraped clean by a giant hand. Foundations, slabs, a few walls. Where hotels, restaurants, houses, and businesses had stood for decades, just rubble. 97% of the buildings in Fort Myers Beach were either damaged or completely destroyed. Sanibel Island, one of the most beloved beach communities in the entire United States, a place that people saved up for years to visit, had its causeway simply washed away. The bridge that connected Sanibel to the mainland collapsed. The island was cut off entirely. People who had stayed to ride out the storm were stranded, with no way in or out. Same thing happened on Pine Island. The bridge connecting Pine Island to Cape Coral was severed. Two communities, isolated, surrounded by floodwater and debris. It took days to reach some residents. Okay, real quick, I have to tell you something about Ian that most people have never heard, and it's one of the strangest scientific things about the whole storm. Hurricanes do not normally produce a lot of lightning. I know that sounds weird. You'd think a storm that violent would be throwing bolts everywhere. But actually, the organized structure of a mature hurricane tends to suppress lightning formation. The way the air circulates in a well-organized eyewall is different from a regular thunderstorm. Less mixing, less of the charge separation that creates lightning. But Hurricane Ian produced a substantial amount of lightning directly in and around its eyewall, the most intense part of the storm, the ring of violent wind and rain surrounding the calm eye. Scientists captured detailed data on this as Ian approached and made landfall, and what they found was genuinely surprising. Ian was showing complex, unusual lightning behavior in its inner core. That kind of data is going to be studied for years, possibly decades. 161 people died because of Hurricane Ian. 150 of them were in Florida. And here is the statistic that should stick with you. The majority of those deaths were from drowning, not from the wind, not from falling debris, from the water, from the storm surge, from that 15-foot wall of seawater that came in faster than people expected, that rose higher than people expected, and that did not leave quickly. That's the thing about storm surge that's so brutally dangerous. Wind damage, as catastrophic as it is survivable if you're in a properly built structure. You shelter in place, you get in a closet, you hunker down. But storm surge is different. Storm surge says, it doesn't matter how good your house is, the water is coming inside. Some of the victims were people who had chosen not to evacuate, who had survived previous hurricanes, who figured this one would be more of the same. Some were elderly and couldn't leave. Some simply didn't believe the forecasts. And some were caught by the speed of it, because one of the most terrifying accounts from Ian survivors was how fast the surge came in. Not a slow, gradual rise, a rush of water. Residents told reporters that within minutes, they went from dry floors to water at their knees, then their waists, then over their heads. Now here's the thing about the money. Because $112 billion is a number that's almost too large to process. That made Ian the costliest hurricane in Florida's entire history. More expensive than Hurricane Andrew in 1992, the storm that literally redefined how Florida built houses. More expensive than Hurricane Irma in 2017. Third most expensive hurricane in all of United States history, behind only Katrina in 2005 and Harvey in 2017. Think about what that number represents. Not just property, entire neighborhoods gone, fishing fleets destroyed, the economic ecosystem of Southwest Florida, the tourism, the fishing industry, the small businesses, wiped out or severely damaged in a single afternoon. But here is the part of this story that genuinely gives me some hope. And look, I know that feels weird to say after everything I just described. Ian was studied, intensely studied, every aspect of it. The rapid intensification over warm water, the eyewall behavior, the lightning anomalies, the storm surge dynamics. All of it was documented with more precision than almost any previous hurricane in history. NOAA had drones in the storm. USGS teams were on the ground within days measuring surge levels. NIST launched a multi-year study on how the built environment failed, specifically to figure out how to build better. And university researchers published findings about the loop current's role in Ian's intensification, findings that could make the next rapid intensification event more predictable. Because every piece of data that scientists pulled from Ian, every pressure reading, every wind measurement, every surge survey, is potentially saving lives in the next storm. Let's talk about what Ian changed. Because storms like this don't just destroy things, they change thinking, they change policy. After Hurricane Andrew in 1992, Florida completely overhauled its building codes. Better wind resistance requirements, stronger roof attachments, impact-resistant windows. And those codes worked. When Ian hit, the structures built to post-Andrew standards generally performed better than older construction. They weren't invincible. Nothing is invincible against a 15-foot storm surge, but the difference in wind damage between old and new construction was measurable and significant. Now, post-Ian, there's a new conversation happening, not just about wind codes, but about flood elevation, about whether it even makes sense to rebuild certain structures at certain heights in certain locations. These aren't easy conversations. For the people of Fort Myers Beach, Sanibel, Pine Island, Cape Coral, this is their home, their identity, the place where their grandparents built their first house, where their kids learned to swim, where they ran their business for 30 years. You don't just walk away from that, and most of them haven't. Most of them are rebuilding, stubbornly, defiantly, lovingly rebuilding. And here's where we circle back to where we started. Ian wasn't supposed to hit Fort Myers. It was supposed to hit Tampa. And that near miss for Tampa is almost as instructive as the direct hit on Southwest Florida. Tampa Bay, with its funnel shape and shallow water, is widely considered by hurricane scientists to be one of the most dangerous storm surge environments in the entire United States. A direct hit from a storm Ian's size could have produced even higher surge levels in the bay than what Fort Myers experienced. Tampa Bay has been sitting there, growing, developing, filling up with millions of residents who have never experienced a major hurricane for over 100 years. Ian reminded every meteorologist and emergency manager in Florida that the question isn't if a major storm will hit Tampa, it's when. So let's recap what we actually know about Ian, the full picture that goes way beyond the news footage. Ian formed in the Caribbean over abnormally warm water. It rapidly intensified, gaining 67% more strength in less than 22 hours because of warm water that extended unusually deep below the surface, partly due to a failure of the loop current to cool the West Florida shelf. It made landfall in Cuba, barely weakened, re-intensified in the Gulf to Category 5, then weakened just slightly to Category 4 at landfall in southwest Florida. Its storm surge of up to 15 feet was the primary killer, drowning people in their homes. 161 lives lost, $112 billion in damage, and enough scientific data collected to keep hurricane researchers busy for the next 20 years. It was the deadliest hurricane to strike Florida since the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. It was the costliest in Florida's history, and it produced lightning behavior in its eyewall that scientists are still trying to fully explain. This wasn't just a hurricane. This was a demonstration of what warmer oceans can do, of what storm surge actually means when it arrives at 15 feet, and of how quickly a tropical depression can become a monster. And look, I know this video is a lot, but I want you to walk away from this understanding one thing above everything else. Storm surge kills, not the wind, the water. If you live on the Gulf Coast or anywhere on a hurricane-prone coastline, and you're ever told to evacuate for storm surge, go. Because the people who survived Ian, they left. Drop a comment below. I want to know what you think about rapid intensification, about whether we're building in the right places, or if you were there when Ian hit. I read every single one. And if you want to go deeper on the storms that shaped Florida, the history of hurricane preparedness, the storms that came before Ian, and what's actually coming next, the next video is right up there. Trust me, you want to see it.